Welcome to BookBound Audio, where the pages of the unknown come alive. Prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows, a tale that will chill your spine and grip your soul. Tonight, we unravel the mystery of the Church of Hollow Saints. Set in the desolation of a 1960s ghost town in the Nevada desert, this is a story of whispers and watchers, of rituals and revelations. Follow renowned detective Elliot Brooks and his loyal companion, Miguel Vasquez, as they step into the depths of the uncanny, facing forces that blur the line between the real and the otherworldly. Turn down the lights, let the darkness embrace you, and dive deep into the haunting echoes of the Church of Hollow Saints. Welcome to the unknown. The Nevada desert swallowed us whole. There was no sound but the crunch of our boots against the dry earth and the occasional whistle of the wind, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. The ghost town loomed ahead like a specter rising from the ashes of forgotten history, unmoving, unspeaking, but somehow alive with a kind of silence that felt ready to break. Elliot walked ahead, his long strides carrying him toward the skeletal remains of the town. His leather coat flapped against the dry wind, and his hat shaded those piercing eyes that never missed a detail. I followed close behind, my shoulders hunched against the uneasy weight pressing down on me. The streets were narrow, the buildings worn and weathered, wooden facades peeling like dead skin. Signs hung askew on rusted chains, their faded lettering whispering of times long past: grocer, saloon, post office. All empty. All forgotten. "This place has a story," Elliot muttered. His voice was low, almost reverent, as if he were addressing the town itself. Every ghost town does. I wanted to ask him what he thought it might be, but the words stuck in my throat. There was an energy here, a heaviness I couldn't quite name. It wrapped itself around me, tugging at the edges of my thoughts, and all I could do was keep moving. The church stood at the heart of the town like a monument to its desolation. Its steeple reached into the sky, cracked and splintered, but defiant. The windows were shattered, shards of stained glass catching the dying light of the setting sun. The front doors were closed, heavy and worn, yet they seemed to pulse with the same eerie energy that hung over the town. Elliot didn't hesitate. He climbed the crumbling steps and pushed the doors open, the sound echoing through the cavernous interior like a groan. I lingered for a moment, one foot on the step and the other still planted on the dusty ground. Something about crossing that threshold felt final, like stepping into a place that didn't want us there. "Miguel," Elliot said, turning back to look at me. His voice was steady, firm, pulling me out of my hesitation. "You coming?" I nodded and followed him inside, the floor creaking beneath me as if protesting our presence. The church was vast but suffocating. Shafts of light filtered through the broken windows, illuminating the rows of pews coated in layers of dust. They stretched out in lines toward the altar at the far end, like forgotten soldiers in formation. The walls seemed to close in around us, their shadows long and dark. And then there were the carvings. Behind the altar, the wall was covered in symbols etched deep into the wood. They were intricate, deliberate, a language I didn't understand but couldn't look away from. Some were sharp and angular, others flowed like water, twisting and writhing as if alive. My eyes traced the lines, each one pulling me closer, daring me to decipher its meaning. "Familiar?" Elliot asked, his voice cutting through the silence. I tore my gaze from the wall and shook my head. "Not exactly. But it feels like I should know what they mean." Elliot stepped closer to the altar, his movement slow and deliberate. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of one carving, and I saw the way his jaw tightened. "There's a purpose here," he said. This wasn't random. Someone made these with intent. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. My gaze returned to the symbols, each one tugging at my thoughts in a way I couldn't explain. They were beautiful, in a way, terrifying, but beautiful. Elliot's flashlight flickered to life, its beam cutting through the shadows as he scanned the room. "Let's see what else we can find," he said, already moving toward the pews. I followed, my own flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by the creak of wood beneath our feet. Dust motes danced in the air, caught in the narrow beams of light. Elliot stopped at one of the pews and crouched down, his hand disappearing beneath the seat. When he straightened, he held something in his hand, a leather-bound journal, its edges worn and cracked. "Someone left this behind," he said, flipping it open. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my ears as I caught glimpses of the words, invocation, sacrifice, hollow saints. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot's eyes narrowed as he scanned the text. "It's a record," he said. "Prayers, rituals." Whoever wrote this, they believed in something. They called it the Hollow Saints. The name hit me like a stone in the chest, its weight pressing down on me with an almost physical force. There was something wrong about it, something that didn't belong. Before I could respond, a sound echoed through the church, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip as the sound grew louder, filling the space with its resonance. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but it carried with it the weight of something alive. Something wrong. "Stay close," Elliot said, his voice sharp. He was already moving, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he scanned the room. I scrambled to follow, my own beam of light darting across the walls and floor. The sound faded as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an even deeper silence. But the unease remained, thick and heavy, curling around my thoughts like smoke. At the back of the church, we found the trap door. It was small, partially hidden beneath a tattered rug, its edges worn smooth. Elliot crouched beside it, his fingers tracing the wood. "Cellar," he said simply. "Do we really want to go down there?" I asked, my voice shaking. He gave me a wry smile, his eyes glinting in the dark. "Do we have a choice?" I sighed, knowing he was right. The answers weren't going to be found on the surface. Taking a deep breath, I steeled myself and followed Elliot as he opened the trapdoor and descended into the waiting darkness below. The air in the cellar was heavier than I'd expected, damp with a chill that crawled up my spine like unwelcome fingers. Elliot descended first, his flashlight cutting through the murky darkness. The wooden ladder creaked under his weight, each step echoing softly in the confined space. I followed close behind, careful not to look down. It was an irrational fear, but the idea of falling into the darkness and vanishing into its depths gnawed at my mind. The cellar was small, the walls lined with crumbling stone and cobwebs stretched thin across the corners. The beams overhead sagged slightly, their surface mottled with rot. The floor beneath us was hard-packed earth, uneven and cold, and scattered with debris, a broken chair, the rusted skeleton of what might have been an old furnace, empty bottles rolling lazily at our feet. And there, at the far end, a gaping hole in the wall led to a passage that disappeared into even darker shadows. Elliot knelt down, running his fingers over the edge of the hole. His flashlight illuminated the jagged edges, revealing that the opening hadn't been there naturally. Someone, or something, had torn it open, clawing through stone with a kind of fervor that made my stomach twist. "This wasn't here when they built this place," Elliot said, his voice calm and steady but edged with something cold. He leaned closer, inspecting the scratches along the stone. "Whatever made this wasn't human." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "How can you tell?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took out a small magnifying glass from his coat pocket, holding it up to the marks etched into the rock. His jaw tightened as he examined them, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made my chest ache. "These scratches aren't from tools or machinery. They're irregular, deep. Like claws." I felt my grip tighten around my flashlight, the plastic casing digging into my palm. "Claws?" I repeated, my voice unsteady. Elliot straightened, brushing the dirt from his hands and turning to me. His face was expressionless, unreadable, but I could see it in his eyes, the faint glimmer of unease that rarely showed. "I don't know what we're dealing with yet," he said, "but it's clear this wasn't a simple accident. Something led them down here." I glanced toward the passage, its darkness unbroken by the weak beams of our flashlights. The air that drifted from its depths was colder than the cellar, heavy with a faint metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. You think they went into the tunnel?" Elliot nodded, his gaze fixed on the shadows ahead. "If we want answers, we'll have to follow." I hesitated. The thought of venturing into that tunnel felt like stepping into the mouth of something alive, something waiting to close its jaws. But Elliot was already moving, his flashlight cutting a path through the darkness. I had no choice but to follow. The tunnel was narrow, the walls rough and uneven, barely wide enough for us to pass without brushing against the stone. The air grew colder with every step, the metallic scent growing stronger, mingling with the earthy aroma of the underground. Our footsteps echoed softly, the sound bouncing off the walls and disappearing into the depths. Elliot was silent, his flashlight trained ahead, his movement steady and deliberate. I tried to focus on the ground in front of me, but the walls seemed to close in, pressing against my thoughts, whispering in the back of my mind. And then the symbols appeared. They were etched into the walls of the tunnel, faint but unmistakable. The same carvings we'd seen upstairs in the church, twisting and writhing as the light from our flashlights danced across them. My breath caught as I looked closer, my eyes tracing the intricate lines. They seemed alive, pulsing with a rhythm I couldn't quite grasp. "These symbols," I started, but Elliot cut me off. "They're a continuation," he said, his voice tight. "Someone didn't stop at the church. They brought them down here." I ran my fingers over one of the carvings, the rough edges catching my skin. "But why? What do they mean?" Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he kept moving forward, his flashlight casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. I followed reluctantly, my gaze lingering on the symbols as we passed. They seemed to watch us, their shapes shifting just out of sight. The tunnel widened suddenly, opening into a larger chamber. The space was vast, the ceiling arching high above, its surface lost in darkness. The walls were covered in carvings, more elaborate than those in the tunnel, their shapes forming patterns that seemed to spiral and converge toward the center of the room. In the center stood a stone pedestal, its surface smooth, unpolished despite the decay around it. On the pedestal lay an object, a small, intricately carved figure, barely larger than my hand. It was humanoid in shape but distorted, its limbs elongated, its face twisted into an expression of agony. Elliot approached the pedestal cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the figure. He didn't touch it, didn't even reach for it. He just stood there, staring, his jaw clenched. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "I don't know. But it doesn't belong here." I stepped closer, the figure pulling at my thoughts, demanding my attention. There was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. It felt alive, in a way that wasn't physical but still tangible. And then the sound returned. It started softly, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The carvings seemed to pulse in time with the sound, their shapes shifting as the hum grew louder. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my grip as the room seemed to come alive around us. "Miguel!" Elliot's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. He grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the tunnel. "We need to move. Now." I didn't argue, couldn't argue. My legs moved on their own, carrying me back the way we'd come, the hum following us like a shadow. It grew louder, deeper, resonating in my chest, making it hard to breathe. We burst into the cellar, the sound cutting off abruptly as we crossed the threshold. The silence hit me like a physical blow, my knees buckling as I gasped for air. Elliot was already climbing the ladder, his movements swift and precise. I followed, the darkness pressing against my back, urging me upward. When we emerged into the church, the light from the broken windows felt like salvation. But the symbols were still there, watching, waiting. Elliot turned to me, his face pale, but steady. "We're dealing with something dangerous," he said, his voice low. "And it's not going to stop." I nodded, unable to speak. The pedestal, the carvings, the sound, they were burned into my mind, refusing to fade. Whatever we'd found beneath the church, it wasn't finished with us. The chill from the cellar still clung to me as Elliot and I made our way back into the church. My breath was shallow, the damp, oppressive air seeming to linger in my lungs as though I'd swallowed some part of the darkness below. Elliot didn't seem fazed, his expression was sharp, all focus, as he traced his flashlight over the symbols etched into the walls. I knew that look. It meant something in his mind was clicking into place, but he wasn't ready to share it. I leaned against the edge of a dusty pew, my leg still trembling slightly. "Elliot," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Whatever was down there, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the carvings. "And yet someone did," he said. His tone was measured, but carried that unmistakable edge of curiosity that drove him into places most people would flee from. "This wasn't an accident, Miguel. The tunnel, the carvings, the pedestal, it's all connected. Someone had a purpose." I shook my head, glancing toward the trapdoor we'd left ajar. The thought of what lay beneath it made my skin crawl. A purpose? "You mean some lunatic stumbled upon this place and decided to carve monsters into the walls?" Elliot turned to me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Not monsters. Symbols. Symbols with meaning. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. It was calculated. Intentional." I pushed off the pew, running a hand through my hair. Intentional or not, it doesn't explain that sound, or the way those carvings seem to. I stopped myself, unsure if I even wanted to say it. "Move?" Elliot finished for me, his expression unreadable. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Move." He tilted his head slightly, as though considering something. "They didn't move, Miguel. Not physically, anyway. But your mind, our minds, are drawn to patterns, to meaning. The carvings are designed to unsettle, to pull at something deeper. I didn't argue, but his explanation did little to ease the knot of dread tightening in my chest. And the sound? What about that? Are you going to tell me it was just the wind? Elliot didn't answer right away. He turned back to the wall, his fingers tracing one of the symbols as if trying to coax its secrets from the wood. No, he said finally. That wasn't the wind. The words hung heavy in the air, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Elliot was a rational man, a skeptic by nature. If he wasn't dismissing what we'd heard, it meant he didn't have an answer. And that scared me more than anything else. Let's step outside for a moment, Elliot said suddenly, cutting through the tension. He was already moving toward the door, his long strides purposeful. We need fresh air. I followed him, grateful for the excuse to leave the oppressive interior of the church. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the desert was bathed in the faint, cold glow of twilight. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a faint whistle that seemed to echo faintly among the abandoned buildings. Elliot stood on the steps, his hands in his coat pockets as he surveyed the town. His gaze was distant, as if he were seeing something I couldn't. I joined him, wrapping my arms around myself against the chill. This place, I muttered, my voice barely audible over the wind. It feels wrong, Elliot. Like it's alive. He nodded, though his expression remained impassive. Places have memories, Miguel. They hold on to the things people do in them. Good or bad. I wasn't sure if he was humoring me or if he really believed that, but either way, his words sent a ripple of unease through me. I turned my gaze toward the horizon, where the faint silhouette of the distant mountains loomed against the darkening sky. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe we were alone, that the town was nothing more than an empty shell. But then I saw it. A flicker of movement, just at the edge of my vision. It came from one of the buildings, a small, squat structure that might have been a workshop or a storage shed. The door swayed slightly, creaking on its hinges as though nudged by an unseen hand. Elliot, I said, my voice tight. I didn't take my eyes off the building. I think we're not as alone as we thought. He followed my gaze, his hand already moving to the revolver holstered at his hip. Where? I pointed to the building, my heart pounding. Over there. By the shed. I saw something, or someone. Elliot didn't hesitate. He moved down the steps and started across the street, his movement steady but cautious. I followed reluctantly, every nerve in my body screaming for me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't leave him. Not now. As we approached the shed, the wind seemed to grow colder, biting at my skin through my jacket. The door creaked again, swinging slightly as if beckoning us inside. Elliot stopped just short of the threshold, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Stay here, he said quietly, drawing his revolver. Like hell I will, I shot back, though my voice lacked the conviction I wanted it to have. I stepped closer, my own flashlight trembling in my hand. Elliot pushed the door open, the sound grating against my ears. The interior was dark, the faint beam of his flashlight barely penetrating the gloom. The air inside was thick, heavy with the smell of mildew and rust. There were shelves along the walls, cluttered with tools and objects I couldn't quite make out. And then I saw it. A figure, hunched and motionless, sitting against the far wall. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my knees go weak. It didn't move, didn't react to the light or to our presence. It was as if it were frozen, suspended in some horrible stillness. "Who's there?" Elliot's voice was firm, commanding. He took a step closer, his flashlight trained on the figure. It didn't respond. As we got closer, I realized it wasn't a person, not anymore. It was a mannequin, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its face a grotesque mask of peeling paint and cracks. But there was something else. A symbol had been carved into its chest, deep and jagged, identical to the ones we'd seen in the church. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice shaking. Elliot knelt down, inspecting the carving. His jaw tightened, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "It's a message," he said quietly. "Someone left this here for us to find." "A message?" I asked, incredulous. "What kind of message is this?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and turned to face the open door, his eyes scanning the street beyond. "One that says we're being watched." The word sent a chill through me, and I turned to look outside. The street was empty, the shadows long and distorted in the fading light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something, or someone, was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. Elliot holstered his revolver and started back toward the church, his movements brisk. "Come on," he said. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with." I followed, though every step felt like a battle against the fear clawing at my mind. The mannequin, the carving, the sound, it was all connected, I knew that much. But the pieces didn't fit together yet, and the picture they were forming was one I wasn't sure I wanted to see. The church felt colder as we stepped back inside, as though whatever life had been carried in by the waning sunlight had abandoned the place entirely. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering faintly as I shook it in frustration. Elliot didn't seem to notice, his focus was unyielding, his steps resolute as he made his way toward the altar once more. His calm demeanor had become an anchor for me, though it sometimes felt as if he were walking willingly into the mouth of chaos, dragging me along with him. I hovered near the edge of the trapdoor, staring at the darkness below as though it could somehow look back at me. It didn't feel empty down there, not really. The silence felt alive, pulsing with a rhythm I couldn't quite discern. My stomach churned at the thought of going back down, but Elliot was already crouching beside the opening, his hands gripping the edges of the wooden ladder. "We're not done here," he said, glancing at me briefly before descending. There was no hesitation in his movement, no falter in his grip. The man had nerves of steel, and every time I saw him plunge headlong into the unknown, I couldn't decide whether to admire him or call him insane. I took a deep breath and followed, every step on the ladder echoing louder in my ears than it should have. The cellar hadn't changed in the short time we'd been away, it was still a tomb of dust and stone, its air damp and stagnant. But the longer I stayed, the more oppressive it felt. It was as if the room itself had grown heavier, the darkness pressing against my skin like an unwelcome touch. Elliot's flashlight swept across the walls as he moved toward the passage, its beam illuminating the carvings that seemed to writhe and twist just out of sight. I avoided looking at them directly, keeping my focus instead on the ground beneath my feet. "Whoever made these," Elliot muttered, gesturing to the symbols as he ducked into the passage, they didn't stop at the surface. They kept going, deeper. I hesitated at the entrance to the tunnel, the jagged edges of the opening scraping against my jacket as I followed him inside. The metallic tang in the air had grown stronger, mixing with the earthy scent of the underground. Each step felt heavier, as though something unseen was dragging at my ankles. My flashlight danced along the rough stone walls, the symbols stretching endlessly before me, their patterns forming a tapestry of incomprehensible meaning. "Elliot," I said, my voice low, "do you have any idea what we're dealing with here?" He didn't answer right away. His flashlight moved methodically, his movements deliberate as he studied the carvings. "No," he admitted, his voice steady despite the weight of the admission. "But someone believed in this. Believed enough to carve it into stone." His answer wasn't comforting, but it was enough to keep me moving forward. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, its walls closing in tighter with every step. And then, without warning, it opened up. The chamber was vast, larger than I'd remembered, its ceiling lost in darkness. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly now, their edges illuminated by a light I couldn't explain. The pedestal still stood at the center, the carved figure resting atop it like a sentinel guarding the void. Elliot stepped into the room cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the walls as he approached the pedestal. I stayed behind, my feet rooted to the ground as I watched him move. The hum from earlier was gone, replaced instead by a suffocating silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of our breathing. "This isn't just a ritual space," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "It's something more." I frowned, my gaze fixed on the figure atop the pedestal. "More? How much more?" Elliot didn't answer. He leaned closer to the pedestal, his flashlight illuminating the figure's distorted features. Its elongated limbs and twisted face seemed to mock us, its expression frozen in an eternal scream. I could feel it pulling at me, demanding my attention, demanding I look closer. And then the glow from the walls grew brighter. It wasn't immediate, it was subtle at first, a faint pulse that sent ripples through the carvings. But as Elliot moved around the pedestal, the light intensified, filling the chamber with a soft, eerie luminescence that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The symbols twisted and writhed in the light, their shapes shifting as though alive. "Elliot," I said, my voice trembling, "this is..." The hum returned. It was louder this time, deeper, vibrating through the stone and through my body. The carvings seemed to pulse in time with the sound, their glow growing brighter with each reverberation. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out as I stumbled back toward the edge of the chamber. Elliot turned to me, his expression sharp but calm. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. I nodded, though my legs felt weak and unsteady. The hum grew louder, resonating in my chest, making it hard to breathe. The carvings moved now, I was sure of it. Their shapes twisted and shifted, forming patterns that defied logic, patterns I couldn't understand. And then the shadows began to move. They crept along the walls, stretching and curling as though alive. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer I watched, the more certain I became. The shadows weren't just reacting, they were acting, their movements deliberate and purposeful. "Elliot!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the hum. "We need to get out of here." He turned to me, his flashlight cutting through the shadows as he approached. "Not yet," he said firmly. "There's more to this." I wanted to argue, wanted to drag him back to the safety of the surface, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He was determined, unyielding. And then the figure moved. It was subtle at first, a twitch of its elongated fingers, a faint shift in its position. But it was enough to send a surge of terror through me. The hum grew louder still, and the carvings pulsed with an intensity that made my vision blur. Elliot moved closer to the pedestal, his flashlight trained on the figure. "Miguel," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos, "I need you to focus." "Focus?" I repeated, my voice shaking. Focus on what? Look at the carvings, he said. Tell me if you see a pattern. Anything. I forced myself to look at the walls, my eyes scanning the writhing symbols despite the fear clawing at my thoughts. At first, it was impossible to make sense of them, their shapes shifting faster than I could process. But then, slowly, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't clear, or not yet, but it was there, hidden within the chaos. I started, but the words stuck in my throat as the figure moved again. This time, its movements were more pronounced, its limbs stretching as though waking from a long slumber. Elliot's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering faintly as he stepped back. Whatever's happening, he said, his voice steady but grim, it's not finished yet. The hum reached a fever pitch, the carvings glowing so brightly that the entire chamber was bathed in light. The figure twisted, its elongated arms stretching toward the walls, its face contorting into an expression of pure agony. And then, suddenly, the light went out. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than the hum had ever been. My flashlight flickered back to life, its weak beam cutting through the darkness. Elliot was still by the pedestal, his movements deliberate as he inspected the figure. We need to leave, he said finally, his voice low. Now. I didn't argue. My legs moved on their own, carrying me back through the tunnel as quickly as I could manage. Elliot followed close behind, his flashlight sweeping over the walls as we made our way back to the cellar. When we emerged into the church, the air felt lighter, though the unease remained. I turned to Elliot, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. What was that? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. His gaze was distant, his expression unreadable. Finally, he turned to me, his voice steady but grim. Something's waking up, he said. And we're in its path. Elliot had this unshakable presence about him as he strode across the church's sanctuary floor, but even his confidence couldn't fully dispel the unease that gnawed at me. Every creak of the old wooden boards beneath our feet felt louder in the oppressive quiet of the place. The air was thick and heavy, like we were walking underwater, and the shadows seemed alive, stretching and flickering in unnatural ways despite the stillness around us. I trailed behind him, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The beam flickered, casting jittery circles of light across the dusty pews and the foreboding carvings etched deep into the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us, unseen but ever present. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, the hairs on my neck bristling each time I did. Elliot's voice cut through the quiet like a blade. Miguel, over here. He was standing near the altar again, his flashlight trained on a section of the wall that had gone unnoticed earlier. I crossed the room quickly, the sound of my boots echoing in the vast emptiness. When I reached him, I saw what had caught his attention, more symbols. These were smaller, more intricate, almost hidden among the larger carvings that dominated the space. What do you make of these? He asked, his tone neutral but probing. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the delicate lines and curves. They were similar to the others we'd seen, yet somehow different. There was a fluidity to them, a grace that the others lacked. I reached out to touch one, hesitating as my fingers hovered just above the surface. They're precise, I said slowly. Almost delicate. Like whoever carved these knew exactly what they were doing. Elliot nodded, his expression unreadable. They're not random. Look at the pattern. I stepped back, trying to take in the symbols as a whole. It was difficult, my eyes kept being drawn to individual shapes, each one demanding my attention. But as I forced myself to focus, I began to see it. The symbols weren't just scattered across the wall, they formed a larger design, a complex and intricate web that seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible rhythm. "Do you see it?" Elliot asked, his voice quiet but insistent. "Yeah," I breathed. "It's alive. The whole thing is alive." He didn't respond right away, his gaze fixed on the wall as though he were trying to will it to give up its secrets. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes sharp and intense. "We're missing something," he said. "These symbols, they're part of the ritual. But they're incomplete." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. "Incomplete? How can you tell?" He gestured toward the edges of the design, where the lines seemed to break off abruptly. "Look here. And here." It's like they stopped midway through. Either they didn't have time to finish, or they didn't want to. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "What happens if we complete it?" Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, his flashlight sweeping across the room as he moved toward the trapdoor once more. I followed hesitantly, my stomach twisting into knots. He stopped at the edge of the opening, peering down into the darkness below. "We need to go back down," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I felt my heart sink. The last thing I wanted to do was descend into that oppressive darkness again, but I knew better than to argue with Elliot when he was like this. He had that look in his eyes, the one that said he'd already made up his mind. "Fine," I muttered, bracing myself as I started down the ladder. "But if we die down there, I'm haunting you." The corner of his mouth twitched in the faintest hint of a smile, but he didn't reply. He followed me down, the ladder creaking under his weight, and within moments, we were back in the cellar. The air was colder now, heavier, and the metallic tang was stronger than ever. It made my skin crawl. Elliot moved quickly, his flashlight darting across the walls as he retraced our steps toward the tunnel. I followed, my own beam of light trembling as it illuminated the twisted carvings that lined the passage. The deeper we went, the more I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me, like the earth itself was trying to swallow us whole. When we reached the chamber, I hesitated at the threshold, my eyes drawn once more to the glowing carvings and the grotesque figure atop the pedestal. The hum had returned, faint but persistent, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I didn't want to go any further, but Elliot stepped inside without hesitation. "This is the source," he said, his voice low but firm. "Everything leads back to this room." I forced myself to follow, my footsteps faltering as the light from the carvings seemed to pulse in time with the hum. The air was electric, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle and my thoughts race. I tried to keep my focus on Elliot, but my gaze kept drifting toward the pedestal. The figure hadn't moved, not visibly, at least, but there was something different about it. It felt heavier, more present. Like it was watching us, waiting for something. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum. Elliot didn't answer right away. He was examining the carvings on the walls, his fingers tracing the lines as though trying to decipher their meaning. Finally, he turned to me, his expression grim. "We need to complete the ritual," he said. I stared at him, my stomach lurching. "You can't be serious." He nodded, his gaze steady. "If we don't, whatever's happening here will only get worse. These symbols, they're a containment. But they're incomplete. We need to finish what they started." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was insane, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't doing this out of curiosity or recklessness. He was doing it because he believed it was the only way to stop whatever was happening. "Fine," I said reluctantly. "But how do we do it? We don't even know what these symbols mean." He gestured toward the pedestal. "It's all connected. The carvings, the figure, the hum, it's part of a larger design. We just need to follow the pattern." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't have a better plan. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer to the wall, my flashlight illuminating the intricate carvings. I could feel the energy pulsing through them, a rhythm that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. Elliot joined me, his focus unyielding, as we worked together to piece together the missing parts of the pattern. It was slow, painstaking work, each line and curve requiring precision and care. The hum grew louder as we worked, the air growing thicker with each passing moment. And then, as we connected the final piece of the pattern, the hum reached a deafening crescendo. The room was bathed in light, the carvings glowing so brightly that I had to shield my eyes. The figure atop the pedestal twisted and writhed, its limbs stretching as though it were coming to life. Elliot grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "Stay back," he warned. I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled away from the pedestal, my heart pounding as the light grew brighter and the hum louder. The air was alive with energy, crackling and sparking like a storm about to break. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light faded, the hum dissipated, and the chamber was plunged into silence once more. I stared at the pedestal, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was still, its twisted form frozen in place. But the carvings on the walls were different now. They no longer glowed, their energy spent. Elliot exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since we'd entered the room. "It's done," he said quietly. I wasn't so sure. The silence felt heavier than before, the weight of it pressing down on me like an invisible hand. Something had changed, I could feel it. But whether it was for better or worse, I couldn't say. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Before something else happens." Elliot nodded, and together we made our way back through the tunnel, the carvings watching us silently as we left the chamber behind. But even as we climbed out of the cellar and into the faint light of the church above, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of whatever lurked in the depths below. Elliot's quiet resolve guided us back into the desolation of the ghost town as the weight of the cryptic chamber pressed heavily against my chest. The sky above had deepened to a bruised shade of night, the stars smothered by thick clouds that seemed to crawl across the heavens. It felt as though the universe itself was folding in on this forsaken place, forcing us further into its grasp. The faint whistle of the wind carried a new tone, uneasy, sharp, almost musical in its reverberation against the dilapidated structures. I clutched my flashlight tightly, the cold metal slick against my clammy palm, its beam swinging across shadows that stretched unnaturally long on the cracked ground. Beside me, Elliot was silent, his focus unwavering as he scanned the remnants of the town. The carvings on the church walls had left their mark on both of us, but Elliot had an uncanny way of internalizing his fears, compartmentalizing them until they fueled his unrelenting search for answers. "There," Elliot said suddenly, pointing to the far end of the street, where the faint outline of another building barely caught the moon's weak light. His voice carried the same resolve as before, but there was an edge to it now, a tension that rarely surfaced. I followed his gaze, my stomach tightening as I saw the shape of the building come into focus. It was smaller than the others, squat and almost misshapen, its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. A sign dangled from rusted chains above the door, its faded lettering illegible from this distance. But it wasn't the building itself that made my pulse quicken, it was the faint glow emanating from inside, flickering like candlelight. Elliot began to move, his strides purposeful as he made his way toward the building. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back, to leave this place and never look back. But I couldn't abandon him, not now. Taking a deep breath, I forced my legs to move, each step heavier than the last. As we approached, the faint glow grew stronger, casting distorted shadows through the broken windows. The sign above the door swung lazily in the breeze, its rusted chains groaning in protest. I could make out the remnants of the lettering now, workshop. The word was barely visible, etched into the worn wood like a scar. Elliot stopped just short of the door, his hand resting lightly on the handle. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Ready?" he asked, though it was more of a formality than a question. I nodded, though my throat felt too dry to speak. Elliot pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly as the room beyond was revealed. The air inside was thick, heavy with a scent of burned wood and something metallic, something sharp enough to make my head swim. The glow came from a series of candles scattered across a workbench, their flames casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The room was cluttered, filled with tools, scraps of metal, and sheets of weathered paper covered in scrawled notes. But my eyes were drawn to the far wall, where the carvings returned once more. These were different, more vivid, more intricate than the ones we'd seen before. They seemed to pulse in the flickering candlelight, their lines twisting and converging into patterns that defied logic. Elliot stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the room as he approached the workbench. I hesitated at the threshold, the weight of the air pressing against my chest like an invisible barrier. Something about this place felt alive, sentient in a way that made my skin crawl. "What do you see?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer right away. He was scanning the notes scattered across the workbench, his brow furrowed in concentration. I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminating the jagged handwriting that filled the pages. They were formulas, diagrams, fragments of text that made no sense to me. But there was one word that repeated over and over again, etched deeply into the paper: eyes. "What does it mean?" I asked, my stomach twisting as I stared at the pages. Elliot straightened, his flashlight swinging toward the carvings on the wall. "It's part of the ritual," he said. "The hollow saints, they're watchers." "Watchers?" I repeated, my voice shaking slightly. "Watching what?" Elliot's gaze shifted to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Us," he said simply. "They're watching us." The word sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my flashlight tremble in my grip. The carvings on the wall seemed to pulse faster now, their patterns shifting as though reacting to Elliot's words. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them, even as the faint hum returned, vibrating in the back of my mind. "I think we're part of it now," Elliot said quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the hum. "The saints, they're watching us because we've become part of the ritual." I swallowed hard, my throat dry and tight. "How do we stop it?" Elliot's gaze returned to the workbench, his flashlight illuminating the fragments of text scattered across the pages. "We need to finish it," he said. "The carvings, the symbols, they're incomplete. But the answers are here. We just need to piece them together." I felt the knot in my chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a stone. The glow from the carvings grew brighter, their shapes twisting faster as the hum intensified. It was as though the room itself was alive, reacting to our presence, to our actions. Elliot moved quickly, his flashlight darting across the pages as he scanned the notes. I joined him, my eyes trying to make sense of the fragmented text that filled the paper. The patterns began to emerge slowly, their meaning still elusive but tantalizingly close. And then the shadows began to move. At first, I thought it was the flickering candlelight, but the longer I watched, the more certain I became. The shadows weren't just reacting, they were acting. They curled and stretched along the walls, their movements deliberate and purposeful. I felt my pulse quicken, my breathing shallow as I stepped back toward the door. "Elliot," I said, my voice trembling, "we're not alone." He didn't look up, his focus unyielding as he pieced together the fragments of the text. "Stay focused," he said firmly. "We need to finish this." I wanted to argue, to tell him we needed to leave, but my voice caught in my throat. The carvings pulsed faster now, their glow casting the room in an otherworldly light. The shadows curled toward us, their shapes distorted and menacing as they reached for the workbench. And then the hum reached a deafening crescendo. The room was bathed in light, the carvings glowing so brightly that I had to shield my eyes. The shadows twisted and writhed, their movements frantic and chaotic as they surrounded us. Elliot's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Now, Miguel," he shouted. "Finish it." I didn't hesitate. My hands moved on their own, tracing the missing lines and curves onto the final page of the text. The glow grew brighter, the hum louder, until the room seemed to collapse inward, its energy crackling and sparking like a storm about to break. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavier than the hum had ever been. My flashlight flickered back to life, its weak beam cutting through the darkness. The carvings were still, their glow extinguished, and the shadows had vanished entirely. But the air remained heavy, charged with the aftermath of something I couldn't explain. Elliot straightened, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he turned to me. "It's done," he said quietly. "For now." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only scratched the surface of whatever lurked in the shadows of this place. The carvings, the glow, the hum, they were gone, but their presence lingered, watching, waiting. We stepped back into the night, the ghost town eerily still as the wind carried the faint whistle of something I couldn't name. I glanced back at the church, its steeple silhouetted against the darkened sky. The hollow saints were silent now, but their eyes remained, watching us from the depths of the veil we'd lifted. The church no longer felt empty, it felt purposeful. The silence wasn't the absence of noise, it was a presence, thick and potent, pressing against my ears and lungs like an unseen force. Elliot had been moving ahead of me, his flashlight cutting through the stagnant gloom, but now he paused near the altar, his hand resting lightly on its edge as he scanned the carvings once more. The room seemed to breathe. I could feel it in the shift of the shadows on the walls, in the faint, rhythmic vibration beneath my boots. We had crossed some invisible threshold in our investigation, something had changed, though neither of us dared to articulate it aloud. Elliot spoke first, his voice low and measured. "It's watching us." I tightened my grip on my flashlight, the beam shaking slightly as I swung it toward the symbols carved into the walls. They had stopped glowing, at least visibly, but they still felt alive, pulsing faintly in the corners of my vision. "What is watching?" I asked, though the question felt redundant. We both knew there was no simple answer. Elliot didn't reply, his focus on the altar. He was studying something, a scrap of paper, folded and yellowed with age, that had been tucked beneath the corner of the cloth. I stepped closer, the tension in the air pulling at me with invisible strings. "What did you find?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He unfolded the paper slowly, his fingers steady despite the weight of the moment. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, scrawled in dark ink that had bled through the parchment in places. Elliot held it up, angling the flashlight so we could both read the words. Asterisk, they are with us. They are the Hollow Saints. The Watchers. They see the truth in all things and the lies we dare not speak. The ritual binds them, but they hunger for release. They wait. Asterisk. My stomach turned at the final line, and I stepped back instinctively, as though distance could shield me from the gravity of what we were uncovering. They wait for what? I asked, though my voice faltered. Elliot folded the paper again, tucking it into his coat pocket. For the ritual to be completed, he said simply. His tone carried no alarm, no fear, just the steady logic of a man who had already accepted the unexplainable as part of his world. The Hollow Saints. The name clung to the air like smoke, lingering long after Elliot's voice had faded. I tried to push it from my mind, to focus instead on the task at hand, but it was useless. My thoughts kept circling back, drawn to the carvings, to the hum that seemed to vibrate just beyond the threshold of sound. The Watchers. Were they here, now, in this room with us? Or were they something more, a presence we could feel but never fully grasp? Elliot moved suddenly, his flashlight swinging back toward the trapdoor. We're going back down, he said, already making his way toward the ladder. I stared at him in disbelief. We've already been down there. We've seen whatever it is that's waiting. What more do you think we'll find? He stopped, turning to face me. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a weight I hadn't seen before. We've seen parts of it, he said. Pieces. Fragments. But if we want answers, we need to see the whole picture. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever we'd uncovered in the chamber below, it wasn't finished. We weren't finished. And the Hollow Saints weren't going to let us walk away without understanding them. Elliot descended first, his movements deliberate and precise as he stepped into the darkness. I followed reluctantly, my flashlight cutting a shaky path through the void. The air grew colder with each rung of the ladder, the metallic tang stronger, sharper, until it felt like I was breathing knives. The cellar was just as we'd left it, its damp, crumbling walls seeming to shift and breathe in the faint light. The trapdoor above closed with a hollow sound, and the silence settled around us like a second skin. Elliot didn't hesitate, leading the way back toward the passage that descended into the depths of the earth. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself were pulling us deeper, holding us in its grasp. The carvings on the tunnel walls began to pulse faintly again, their lines twisting and converging in patterns I couldn't decipher. The hum returned, subtle at first, barely audible beneath the sound of our breathing. But the further we walked, the louder it grew. When we reached the chamber, I froze. The pedestal was glowing faintly now, its surface alive with shifting light that pulsed in time with the hum. The figure atop it remained still, but it felt more present than before, more vivid, more real. Its elongated limbs and twisted face seemed to mock us, its eyes hollow and dark. Elliot stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the walls as he scanned the carvings once more. I stayed at the threshold, the weight of the room pressing against me like an invisible hand. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest, through my thoughts, until it felt like my very bones were resonating with its rhythm. "We're close," Elliot said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "The ritual, it's almost complete." I stared at him, my heart pounding. Complete? But what does that mean? What happens when it's complete? He didn't answer, his focus on the pedestal now. He approached it slowly, his flashlight sweeping across its surface as he studied the glowing lines that twisted and writhed beneath the figure. "It's been waiting for us," he said quietly. "The saints, they've been waiting. For us." The words echoed in my mind, twisting like the carvings on the walls. I felt the hum vibrate through my thoughts, pulling at me, dragging me toward the pedestal. I wanted to run, to leave this place and never look back, but my legs refused to move. Elliot reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface of the pedestal. The glow intensified, the hum reaching a fever pitch, and the figure atop it began to shift. Its limbs twitched, its hollow eyes turning toward us, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't human, it was layered, fractured, 1,000 voices speaking as one. It filled the chamber, vibrating through the walls, through my chest, through my very soul. The words were incomprehensible at first, but slowly they began to take shape. "You have seen. You have known." The hollow waits no longer. The light from the pedestal exploded outward, filling the chamber with a blinding glow. The carvings pulsed faster, their shapes converging into a single, chaotic design that seemed to twist in on itself. The figure writhed atop the pedestal, its movements frantic and violent, and the voice continued. "The veil is lifted. The watchers awaken. The hollow saints are free." And then the light disappeared. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy and suffocating. The pedestal no longer glowed, its surface dark and cold. The carvings were still, their energy spent, and the figure atop the pedestal was frozen once more. Elliot straightened, his movements deliberate as he turned to face me. "It's done," he said, his voice steady. "We've lifted the veil." I stared at him, my thoughts racing. "The veil? What does that mean? What happens now?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze distant as he scanned the chamber. Finally, he turned to me, his expression grim. "It means we're not alone anymore." The church seemed to inhale as we emerged from the depths, its cavernous interior colder and more oppressive than before. The air felt heavier now, as if some unseen force was pushing against us with its intangible weight. My flashlight flickered, and I smacked it against my palm, the brief strobe illuminating Elliot's somber face in harsh bursts of light. He hadn't spoken since we had left the chamber below, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something raw, something I couldn't quite place. The carvings on the walls had lost their glow, yet they seemed more vivid in the gloom. I had tried to convince myself that we'd ended something, contained it, but the lingering sense of dread gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. Whatever we'd stirred wasn't done with us. And the hollow saints, those watchers, were no longer silent. Elliot finally broke the silence, his voice low and deliberate. "Miguel, start piecing it together." I blinked at him, confused. Piecing what together? We barely made it out of there. He turned toward me, his eyes sharper than I'd ever seen them. "Everything we've seen, everything we've uncovered, it's all connected. The saints, the carvings, the hum, it isn't random. There's a pattern here. We just need to find it." I sighed, the tension in my chest growing tighter. And then what? What happens when we find the pattern? Elliot didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the altar, his flashlight sweeping across the worn wood. I don't know yet, he admitted, his voice betraying a hint of unease. But we're running out of time. The words sent a chill down my spine. Time for what? The saints were free, weren't they? The ritual had been completed, or had it? The question swirled in my mind like a storm, but no answers came. I followed Elliot as he moved through the church, his flashlight catching glimpses of the carvings, each one more intricate than the last. They seemed to mock us now, their twisted lines whispering secrets we couldn't understand. What are you looking for? I asked, my voice echoing faintly in the vast space. Anything, Elliot said. Something to explain what happens next. I wanted to tell him there was nothing left to find, that we should leave this place before it swallowed us whole. But something about his tone, his resolve, kept me quiet. Elliot wasn't just searching for answers, he was preparing for whatever came next, and I couldn't abandon him. We moved through the church, the cold air biting at my skin. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. The carvings loomed over us, their presence suffocating. My flashlight caught the edge of a pew, its surface scratched and worn, and I froze. Elliot, I said, my voice trembling. Come here. He was at my side in an instant, his flashlight trained on the pew. The scratches weren't random, they formed patterns, symbols, smaller than those on the walls, but just as deliberate. Elliot knelt down, his fingers tracing the lines. These weren't here before, he said quietly. Someone, or something, left them. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What do they mean? Elliot didn't answer. He stood, his gaze moving to the nearest wall, where the carvings seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness. They're watching, he said, his voice barely audible. The saints, they're watching us. I felt my knees go weak, and I gripped the edge of the pew for support. Watching us? Why? What do they want? Elliot turned to me, his expression grim. To understand. To consume. To become. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my grip. Become? Become what? Elliot stepped closer, his voice calm but intense. They're hollow, Miguel. Empty. They mimic us, reflect us, but they're not complete. They want to fill the void, to take what they lack. And we're their answer. The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching and curling as though alive. I felt my breath quicken, my pulse pounding in my ears. The saints weren't just watching, they were waiting for us to falter, to give in to the fear that gnawed at our minds. Elliot grabbed my arm, his grip firm but steady. Stay focused, he said. We're not done here. I nodded, though my thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt and fear. We moved through the church, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we scanned every corner, every crevice, for something, anything, that could tell us what to do next. It was Elliot who found it. Near the altar, tucked beneath a tattered cloth, was another journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle with age. He opened it carefully, the pages filled with the same spidery handwriting as the one we'd found before. This is it, he said, his voice firm. The answers are here. I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminating the pages as Elliot read aloud. The words were cryptic, fragmented, but they painted a picture that sent shivers down my spine. Asterisk: to bind them is to deceive them. To deceive them is to betray yourself. The saints are hollow, and they will fill the void. They will take what is given. They will take ... asterisk. Elliot's voice faltered, and I saw the flicker of unease in his expression. Miguel, he said quietly, we're part of this now. The ritual isn't over, it's just beginning. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the church with a force that made the walls tremble. The carvings glowed faintly, their twisted lines converging into patterns I couldn't understand. I felt the weight of the saints pressing against me, their presence suffocating, their whispers crawling through my thoughts. Elliot grabbed my arm again, his grip urgent. We need to move, he said. The saints, they're not waiting anymore. I didn't argue. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the door as the hum grew louder, the glow brighter. The carvings twisted and writhed, their shapes shifting faster than I could process. The church seemed to close in around us, its walls breathing, its shadows curling toward us like claws. We burst into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The ghost town was eerily still, the wind carrying faint whispers that seemed to echo from the shadows. I turned to Elliot, my chest heaving, my thoughts racing. What now? I asked, my voice trembling. Elliot's gaze was distant, his expression unreadable. We wait, he said finally. We wait for them to show us what they want. The word sent a shiver through me, and I glanced back at the church, its steeple silhouetted against the darkened sky. The saints were silent now, but their presence lingered, watching us, waiting for the ritual to reach its end. The night was alive. That was the only way I could describe it. It wasn't just the cold wind scraping through the barren streets or the faint whistle of the air catching on splintered wood, it was the feeling, the pulse, the almost imperceptible vibration that hummed in my bones. The ghost town around us had become more than a backdrop. It was the stage, and we, the unwilling performers in a play we didn't understand. The hollow saints were silent, but their presence was palpable, oppressive, and inescapable. Elliot moved with quiet determination, his flashlight steady as he cut through the darkness with long, purposeful strides. I struggled to keep up, the exhaustion of the last few hours finally clawing at me. My legs felt heavy, my chest tight. The journal he had found earlier was tucked under his arm, its worn pages holding secrets we could barely comprehend. The church isn't finished with us, Elliot muttered. He didn't look back, his voice carrying just enough weight to pierce through my fatigue. Neither are the saints. I wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to demand an explanation for why we were still here, why we hadn't run as far from this cursed place as we could. But the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I already knew the answer. The saints wouldn't let us leave. Not until they had what they wanted. We reached the church doors, their warped wood glowing faintly in the moonlight. The carvings etched into the surface seemed deeper now, more pronounced, as though they'd been carved anew while we were gone. I hesitated on the steps, the faint hum that had haunted us since the chamber below now vibrating beneath my feet. Elliot pushed the doors open without hesitation, the creak of the hinges echoing like a scream in the vast emptiness. The air inside was colder than before, biting at my skin and setting my nerves on edge. The carvings along the walls shimmered faintly, their twisted lines alive with a subdued energy that made my stomach churn. They're waiting, Elliot said, stepping into the sanctuary. His flashlight swept across the room, its beam catching the faint glint of something near the altar. He moved toward it, his movements careful but unflinching. I followed reluctantly, every step feeling like I was sinking deeper into a pit I'd never climb out of. My flashlight trembled in my grip, the beam swinging wildly as I tried to focus on anything but the carvings watching us from every wall. Elliot stopped at the altar, his gaze fixed on the object that had caught his attention. It was a mirror, its surface cracked and weathered, but reflecting the dim light with an almost unnatural clarity. The frame was ornate, its edges etched with the same twisting patterns as the carvings on the walls. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot didn't answer immediately. He crouched down, his fingers brushing the surface of the mirror. The glass rippled under his touch, the reflection distorting into a whirl of shadows and light before settling again. "A conduit," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. "It's how they see." I felt a chill run down my spine, the weight of his words settling heavily in my chest. "See what?" "Us?" Elliot stood, his flashlight trained on the mirror. "Everything." The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and up into my legs. The carvings on the walls began to glow faintly, their lines shifting and writhing as though reacting to the energy building around us. The air grew heavier, charged with a tension that made it hard to breathe. Elliot turned to me, his expression grim. "We need to face them." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "Face them?" "Elliot, we don't even know what they are. How are we supposed to face them?" He didn't respond, his focus already back on the mirror. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the journal and flipping it open to a marked page. His eyes scanned the text quickly, his brow furrowing in concentration. "They're hollow because they lack purpose," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "They're watchers, mirrors of us, but they're empty. They want to become whole. And you think we can, what? Stop them?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. Elliot looked at me, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "No. But we can decide what they become." Before I could respond, the hum reached a deafening crescendo. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, their lines converging into a single, chaotic pattern that pulsed with an otherworldly light. The mirror trembled on the altar, its surface rippling like water as shadows began to twist and writhe within its depths. And then they came. The shadows spilled from the mirror like smoke, curling and coiling as they filled the room. They moved with deliberate purpose, their forms shifting and morphing into shapes that defied logic. Faces emerged briefly from the darkness, distorted, hollow, and empty, before vanishing again. Elliot stepped forward, placing himself between me and the altar. His flashlight cut through the shadows, the beam catching glimpses of their shifting forms. "They're here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is their moment." The shadows swirled around us, their movements faster, more frantic. The air was electric, crackling with energy that made my skin prickle. The carvings on the walls pulsed in time with the shadows, their patterns shifting and converging in ways I couldn't understand. Elliot held up the journal, his voice cutting through the chaos. "They're hollow saints, watchers of truth and lies," he said, his words steady and deliberate. "They wait to be filled, to take what is given." The shadows paused, their movement slowing as though listening. The air grew heavier, the tension so thick it felt like it would crush me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Elliot turned to me, his gaze piercing. "Miguel, they need purpose. We have to show them, give them something to hold on to." I stared at him, my mind racing. "And if we don't?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The shadows would take what they wanted, with or without our consent. This was our only chance to guide them, to shape them before they consumed everything. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, my legs trembling but steady. The shadows turned toward me, their hollow faces staring with an intensity that made my chest ache. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I couldn't back down. "You want to become whole," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You want purpose, meaning, identity." The shadows shifted, their forms rippling as though in agreement. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their energy converging on the mirror, which now glowed with an intensity that made my eyes water. I glanced at Elliot, his expression calm but expectant. He nodded, his gaze urging me to continue. "You're empty because you reflect us," I said, my voice gaining strength. "But you don't have to be. You can be more, if you choose to be." The shadows seemed to pause, their movement slowing as the room grew still. The mirror glowed brighter, its surface rippling as the reflections within began to take shape. They weren't hollow anymore, they were us. Twisted and distorted, but undeniably us. And then, with a final surge of energy, the light from the mirror exploded outward, blinding and consuming everything in its path. I felt the ground tremble beneath me, the air crackling with power as the shadows dissolved into the light, their forms disappearing into the glow. When the light faded, the church was silent. The carvings were gone, their presence erased from the walls. The mirror lay shattered on the altar, its surface dark and cold. The air was still, the oppressive weight lifted. Elliot stood beside me, his expression unreadable as he stared at the shattered glass. "It's done," he said quietly. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, my chest heavy with the weight of what we'd just witnessed. The saints were gone, but their presence lingered, like the faint echo of a melody that refuses to fade. Outside, the first rays of dawn pierced the horizon, their light washing over the ghost town in soft, golden hues. The darkness was gone, replaced by a fragile stillness that felt both comforting and hollow. Elliot turned to me, his gaze steady. "Let's go," he said. I nodded, my legs unsteady as I followed him out of the church. The wind was soft now, carrying with it the faint scent of something clean, something new. And as we left the ghost town behind, I couldn't help but glance back one last time, the silhouette of the church fading into the distance. The hollow saints were gone. But their eyes, those unseeing, empty eyes, would never stop watching. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through the Church of Hollow Saints. We hope it left your heart racing and your imagination running wild. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with fellow mystery and horror enthusiasts, and subscribe to BookBound Audio for more spine-tingling tales. Stay tuned, there are many more haunting stories waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, keep your lights on and your curiosity alive.